I hurried beneath the awning of the velvet oak, shaking the rain from my thin coat as the Thursday night traffic rushed past the puddles behind me. 2 weeks. That was how long it had been since I walked out of Eric's apartment for the last time, leaving behind 2 years of suffocating love and arguments that had slowly eroded who I was. Tonight was supposed to be nothing more than a small private anniversary, just me, a decent cocktail, and the quiet relief of knowing that on Monday morning I would have an interview with a design firm called Madison & Locke, a real opportunity, the beginning of something new in the field I had loved since college. Before everything with Eric collapsed, I used to dream of creating spaces where people felt like they could be fully themselves. But loving him had been like a tightening rope around my confidence, pulling until I doubted every part of my own ability. I chose a single chair near the window, where the warm golden light inside softened itself across the rain-streaked glass. The bar felt like a low, comforting symphony, old jazz drifting gently through the air, the scent of oak mixing with leather, and the faint vanilla of bourbon. I set my bag down, pulled out the chair, and signaled to the bartender for a martini. No sugar, ice cold. He nodded without a word and disappeared behind the counter. I pulled out my phone and texted Julia, telling her I had arrived and that the place was beautiful, and she replied within seconds, reminding me not to drink more than 2 and not to talk to anyone wearing a gray suit, adding a little laugh and telling me to call if anything happened. I smiled to myself. Julia always worried about me as if I were her younger sister, but tonight I did not want to be someone anyone needed to worry about. I wanted to feel alive again, standing on my own 2 feet. The martini appeared before me, chilled and perfectly clear, exactly the way I liked it. I lifted the glass, watching the surface tremble beneath the soft ceiling lights, and let a small sip cool my throat like a thin veil of frost. Everything seemed to quiet inside me, at least until I saw him. Eric, standing in the doorway, hair soaked from the rain, his eyes cutting through the room as if searching for something he once owned. My heart dipped, not because I still loved him, but because I was not ready to see that face again. The cold certainty, the way he always knew how to make me feel small. He should not have known I was here. No one knew. Only Julia, and me. If the moment he stepped out from the shadowed corner of the bar, silent and steady enough to shift the air itself, made your heart pause the way mine did, then do not forget to subscribe to our channel, to like and share this video so you can follow these emotional and suspenseful stories every day, and tell me where you are listening from, the city or country, so I know where Claire's journey toward freedom and courage has reached you in this wide world. He moved toward me as if the distance between us had never existed. My body froze, my hand locked around the cold, trembling stem of my glass. Eric's gaze held mine, confident and arrogant, as if power still rested entirely in his hands. I wanted to turn away, to pretend I had not seen him, but he was already standing at my table, saying my name in that low voice touched with the familiar trace of cigarette smoke. He claimed he had only been passing by and had never expected to find me here, and I bit my lip to steady myself, telling him not to lie. He shrugged the way he always did when he wanted to make something sharp feel harmless, insisting he only wanted to say hello and that we had no need to be tense. I did not respond, glancing around and hoping someone would accidentally break the moment, but everyone was lost in their own drinks and quiet conversations. Then, from a dim corner near the bar, I felt a gaze. I could not explain how I sensed it, only that it was clear, enough to make me lift my head. A man sat alone with one hand resting lightly on a glass of untouched whiskey, his deep, steady eyes fixed on me. He did not look at Eric or the crowd, only at me, as though he were reading an open page. He wore a black shirt beneath a matching jacket without a tie, nothing flashy, yet he carried the air of someone who shaped a room rather than belonged to it. I looked at him only for a breath before turning back to Eric. Eric suggested I should go home because the rain was heavy, but I told him I was fine and that he no longer needed to worry about me. He reached for the handle of my bag in an unconscious but controlling gesture, telling me he needed only a few minutes to talk, and I told him firmly that I did not want that. Meeting his eyes for the first time that night, a part of me trembled, but another part stood up inside me, steady and rising. He smirked and told me I had changed, and I answered that I hoped I had changed for the better. His eyes went colder. Then, without warning, the man from the corner walked toward us. He did not rush. Each step was calm and deliberate, quiet enough not to disturb the room, yet strong enough to make the air pause. He stopped a single step from Eric, looked at me gently, then turned to him, telling him that I had said I did not want to talk and that he should respect that. His voice was low and clear, never raised, but every word carried weight. Eric asked who he was, and the man replied simply that he was someone who did not like to see anyone being pushed or cornered. I looked at him, knowing nothing about him, not even his name or his reason for stepping into this moment, yet my heart pounded with something that was not fear, perhaps gratitude, perhaps astonishment. Eric laughed thinly, stepping back with his hands slightly raised as if in surrender, though his eyes darkened, asking whether the man was not afraid of trouble. The man did not answer. He only held Eric's gaze for another beat before turning to me and asking if I wanted to stay. When I nodded, he told Eric he should leave. After a brief hesitation, Eric shrugged and wished us a pleasant evening before walking out, leaving a long trail of rainwater across the wooden floor. I still did not fully understand what had just happened, but I knew one thing with a certainty that settled deep inside me. In that moment, I was no longer alone. The man returned to his seat as quietly as he had risen, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But everyone in the bar had fallen silent, and I found that I could not look away from him. I remained seated with my hand resting lightly on the untouched cocktail, my throat dry yet my mind perfectly clear, and even though no one in the bar spoke a word, I knew everyone had witnessed the brief exchange moments earlier, especially the man who had stood up to protect me without knowing who I was. I looked back toward him and saw him speaking quietly to the bartender before, signaling to a nearby server, his eyes sweeping across the room, not like a stranger assessing unfamiliar surroundings, but like someone who knew every subtle shift of light and shadow in the air. I had no time to make sense of it before a familiar gray silhouette appeared at the door. Eric had come back. He did not step farther inside but lingered at the threshold, scanning the room. I held my breath. He was searching for something, or no, for someone. But this time, he did not walk toward me. He moved toward the bar instead. The bartender had just poured me another drink, perhaps thinking I needed one, and Eric said something to him that made the man stiffen before nodding reluctantly. Eric placed something beside my glass. I could not see clearly from a distance, only knew that Damien had seen it too. He rose from his chair and walked toward the bar, not swiftly but with unwavering purpose. I shot to my feet, every part of me screaming that something was terribly wrong. Damien spoke, softly to the bartender, who pointed toward my cocktail, his face paling. Damien bent down to examine the drink, then turned silently to Eric, who stood only a few steps away. His voice was quiet but cold enough to burn. He asked whether Eric thought this was the place to test his luck, and Eric shrugged with an air of innocence, claiming he merely wanted to add a bit of spice to the night. Damien lifted the glass to eye level and looked directly at him, saying that spice was meant only for those who agreed to it, and he had not seen my agreement. I watched the muscles in Eric's face tighten. He demanded to know who Damien was to interfere, but Damien did not answer. Instead, he held out the cocktail to him and told him that if it was safe, he should drink it. Eric gave a thin smile and glanced around the room as if waiting for someone to speak on his behalf, but no one did. The bar fell into a suspended quiet, and Damien did not break eye contact as he repeated the word drink. Eric stepped back and muttered that he was not thirsty. But Damien did not move, telling him this was not an invitation but a choice, to drink or to have the police called so they could check fingerprints, security footage, witness statements, and everything else he had left behind. Eric stared at him, then shifted his gaze toward me as though hoping I would intervene, but I said nothing and neither did anyone else. In the long, suffocating silence that followed, Eric lifted the glass and took a swallow. He had barely set it down when his body wavered and his face drained of color, his lips stiffening, sweat gathering at his brow. Damien stepped forward and caught him before he hit the floor. There were no screams, only a ripple of silent shock moving through the room as he told a nearby server to call for an ambulance, his voice steady and calm. He placed Eric on his side and kept his head supported, murmuring that he was still breathing, faintly but enough. I could not look away. Damien showed no panic and no anger, only the composed certainty of someone who had long been accustomed to far darker situations. By the time the paramedics arrived, Eric had begun to convulse lightly, and when one of them asked Damien for his name, he replied that he was simply the person who had stopped a disaster. I saw respect flicker in the paramedic's eyes, Not because he viewed Damien as a hero, but because he recognized someone who had stepped in without wanting credit. Damien turned to me, offering just a single look without a word. Yet I knew from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. I stood frozen in the corner of the bar, my hand gripping the strap of my bag without remembering when I had picked it up, and everything felt too fast, too cold, too real. Eric was carried out on a stretcher, the flashing blue and red lights outside shimmering across the ceiling like broken reflections of a storm. The room fell into a hush after the chaos, and Damien walked toward me with the same slow composure as before. But to me he now seemed like someone who had stepped out of an entirely different world. I had never seen anyone act the way he had, without trembling, without hesitation, without centering himself in the moment. He stood before me, not too close, and asked in a voice as gentle as a warm cloth laid over a frantic mind whether I was all right. I nodded out of reflex, then shook my head because I was neither fine nor falling apart, simply trembling, aware that the slightest touch might shatter me. Damien looked at me, not with pity but with quiet concern, and asked whether there was anyone who could come get me. I shook my head, feeling my eyes burn though. I fought to keep the tears from falling. He told me he could call a car to take me home, then paused as if weighing something carefully, and added that if I did not feel safe, he had an apartment nearby with security and a guard on duty where I could stay for a night until everything settled. I never stayed in a stranger's home, but I had also never had an ex-boyfriend attempt to drug me in front of a room full of people. All my old boundaries felt thin and useless. I looked at Damien, at his dark, steady eyes that held no pressure and only waited, and I gave a small nod. There was no reason to return to my old apartment where Eric once had a key, a place I had once believed was a home. Damien simply nodded, gestured toward a side exit where a black car waited, and walked beside me without touching me, like a guide who understood the fragility of the moment. The black SUV glided through the wet streets, the yellow streetlights pooling across the pavement like chilled honey, and I sat in the back with my hands resting on my knees, staring out the window and focusing on the present so I would not be dragged back into the terror of earlier. Damien sat in the front beside the driver, silent, not asking for my full name, not asking about my past, not showing curiosity. His silence felt like an unspoken vow that everything was now under control. When the car stopped before a modern building with clear glass and warm hallway lights, Damien looked back at me and told me to go to the 6th floor, that the apartment door would already be open, and that he would have food brought up. If I needed anything, he said. His number was already saved in my phone. I blinked and asked when he had taken my phone, and he told me it was while I had been staring at Eric and forgetting the drink in my hand, his voice softening slightly as he said it had been just to make sure. I stepped into the elevator alone, my heart still racing but no longer panicked, and when the apartment door opened, I found a quiet, warm space with beige walls, soft golden lighting, minimalist furniture, and the fresh scent of new oak. I set down my bag and sank onto the edge of the sofa without removing my coat or turning on any additional lights, sitting there in the gentle glow and feeling, for the first time in many months, as though I could finally breathe. The phone buzzed beside me just as I let myself sink into the softness of the sofa, and the screen lit up with Julia's name followed by 3 unread messages. I tapped them open, already knowing she would not let the night pass quietly. The first read, "Are you okay? I saw an ambulance in Midtown. Do not tell me it was at that bar." The second said, "Claire, please answer me. I am not joking." And then the last one, "If you do not respond, I am calling the police." I quickly called her back, pressing the phone to my ear and closing my eyes as her voice burst through almost immediately, breathless and frantic, demanding to know where I was and what had happened. I sat up and forced my voice to stay steady, telling her I was all right, that something had happened but someone had helped me. She went quiet for a few seconds, her tone dropping but still tight, as she asked who, exactly who, had helped me. I hesitated before telling her it was a man who had been there when Eric tried to drug my drink, a man who stopped it and truly saved me. Silence hit again, and I could picture Julia frowning hard on the other end. She asked where I was, and I took a breath before admitting I was at his apartment for the night, that he had offered and that I did not want to go home, not yet. Julia practically shouted that I had followed a stranger home just because he saved me once and asked what I was thinking. I closed my eyes, exhausted, and told her it was not like that that he was nothing like Eric, that he had not touched me, had not asked questions, had not even looked at me for too long, that he had simply given me space. Julia went silent longer this time, and when she spoke again her voice had softened, though still edged with worry, asking me to promise I would be careful and not trust too easily, reminding me that the shock of what happened might make temporary safety feel permanent. I whispered that I knew, that I would not let anyone take advantage of me ever again, not even the good ones. After the call, I looked around the apartment once more. Everything was spotless down to the smallest detail. Nothing flashy, nothing lived in, like a place kept ready for someone who might need it. I stepped out onto the balcony where the city lights glimmered across the rain-damp floor, the distant hum of traffic and nightlife carrying on while I stood between quiet and chaos, uncertain of what waited ahead. I woke the next morning to the faint scent of wood and freshly brewed coffee lingering in the living room, and found a small note positioned neatly on the table, the handwriting precise and firm, saying he had arranged for breakfast to be delivered and that I should call if I needed anything, adding that he would not disturb me. I held the note, feeling something between relief and unfamiliar warmth. No late-night messages, no senseless questions, no figure standing over the bed. Only silence where I needed it, and distance where it mattered. He had not stepped into my world, had not used my vulnerable moment for anything. He had simply left me alone, and somehow that made me think of him far more than I wanted to admit. I sat on the balcony with the cup of coffee he had left, unsure why the peace I felt was so strong, not because the place was safe or the drink was perfect, but because of the way he stepped back, asked nothing, pressed nothing, showing up only enough to remind me I was not alone. As I began gathering my things to leave, the door opened and Damien walked in wearing a white shirt with the sleeves pushed up, his face alert though his eyes carried a trace of sleeplessness. He nodded a brief greeting and went straight to the kitchen to refill his coffee, asking without looking at me whether I had slept well, and I told him the apartment was truly quiet, then added that I had not expected a stranger to let someone stay in his home so easily. He set his cup down and leaned against the counter, pausing before answering that he did not let strangers stay, but that I did not seem like someone he needed to guard himself against. His words surprised me and I asked why, and for the first time since he entered he looked at me and told me he had met someone like Eric before, that he recognized the look in my eyes when I faced him, the fear hidden beneath a thin shell of strength, the same look his younger sister once had. I sat upright and repeated softly, "His sister," and he nodded, his gaze dimming as if opening a door he rarely touched, telling me her name was Elena and that she had been 6 years younger, and after their parents died he had been the one to care for her. They had grown up in a rough neighborhood, he said, but he always believed that being strong enough and hard enough would keep her safe. He fell silent a moment. I did not interrupt. Then he told me that when Elena was 19 she fell in love with a man nearly 10 years older, a man with money and sweet words who convinced her no one loved her the way he did, and by the time Damien sensed something was wrong, it was already too late. The man began to control every part of her life, her friends, her phone, even her clothes, and each time Damien asked, Elena insisted everything was fine and that he was overreacting. His voice thinned as he said he had been wrong to leave it alone. I swallowed hard. Damien continued without looking at me, telling me that one night Elena called him, her voice shaking, and he heard breaking objects and screaming in the background. He drove there in less than 10 minutes, but when he arrived the door was already open and the police had just reached the scene, and Elena lay on the floor with blood trailing from her head. My hand lifted to my mouth and I could not speak. Damien closed his eyes as if pushing the memory back into place and said the man had claimed it was an accident, that they had argued, and Elena had slipped, and there had been no clear evidence to charge him, no witnesses, only Damien and a man who knew how to erase everything that could prove the truth. He clenched his hand, his voice no longer cold but tightly held together, saying that from that day he stopped believing in justice and believed only in his own limits, that he had not saved his sister, and when he saw the look in my eyes the night before, he knew that if he walked away he would carry another death on his conscience. I looked at him then, seeing for the first time a crack in the armor he wore, realizing that the man who had seemed so controlled and distant was carrying a wound that had never healed. I placed my hand gently on the armrest and told him softly that I was grateful, not only for the night before, but for not staying silent the way so many others had. Damien did not respond. He only gave a slight nod before turning back to his coffee. but I knew that in the space between the unspoken words, a thin, fragile trust had begun to form, and he no longer felt like a stranger to me. I returned to the apartment that afternoon after a long walk around the neighborhood, my mind still spinning with the story of Elena. The images Damien had described clinging to my thoughts, as if each detail had found a way to anchor itself to the quiet corners of my consciousness. And I could not begin to imagine the helplessness of knowing your own sister was being abused and being unable to stop it until it was too late, a helplessness that struck too close to the feeling of being controlled and slowly suffocated by someone you once trusted. When I stepped inside, Damien stood before the large window with a phone in his hand, speaking to someone in Italian, his voice low and unhurried, yet carrying a decisive weight that was impossible not to notice. And when he ended the call and turned toward me, his expression was softer than it had been that morning, as he asked if my walk had gone well. I nodded and set my bag on the chair, telling him the air was fresher than I had expected, and he gave a faint smile before mentioning he suspected I had not eaten lunch. I admitted I had not, that I had not had the mind for it, and he walked toward the dining table, pulling a thin envelope from which he slid a small file. He told me he had a proposal, that if it felt too soon for me to go home or if I was not ready to leave the apartment, he could offer me a temporary option, a job. I frowned, unsure of what he meant, and he explained that he owned a restaurant a few blocks away called Bella Rosso, meaning Red Rose, a quiet place frequented mostly by regulars, people in the industry, or those who needed privacy, and that he thought I might be able to contribute there. I told him I was not a server, half joking and half serious, but he shook his head and said he knew that the restaurant had recently been redesigned, and he had noticed my sense of aesthetics, that I could help evaluate the space, adjust the layout, even offer suggestions for decoration and the overall guest experience. Not a permanent role unless I wanted it, but something he believed fit my interior design background. I was surprised and asked how he knew I studied design, and he reminded me he had overheard me telling the bartender the night before about my interview on Monday, guessing it was not the first job I had applied for, adding that he had seen the way I arranged things in the apartment when I stayed over and recognized an eye for detail. I looked at him without my usual guard and asked how long he wanted my help, and he said 1 week to start, that if it worked I could consider staying longer, and if not, it would still be experience, income, a safe space, and the comfort of not being alone. I sat quietly, weighing everything, thinking of Madison and Locke, the Monday morning dream I had once prepared for with such excitement. But then I looked around this apartment, at the man, standing before me, the only person who had not asked me to pretend to be strong, and a strange sense of ease crept in, softening the old ambitions I had clung to, and I realized I did not want to owe anyone anything. Yet I also could not deny that this was a chance to breathe. I told him I would try, my voice unsure but clear enough to count as a promise, and then I drew a deeper breath and looked directly at him. More certain, as I said, I would call and cancel the interview at Madison and Locke because I believed I had found the place I was meant to be. Damien nodded, surprise flickering briefly in his eyes before settling back into his usual calm composure, as if some part of him had quietly hoped for that answer. And he told me to be ready the next morning at 10, that he would send someone to pick me up, adding that for now we should go eat because he did not want his future colleague working on an empty stomach. For the first time in days, I laughed, a real unguarded laugh, and, for a fleeting moment I believed that things might truly be changing, not quickly, not perfectly, but beginning, and I needed a beginning. Bella Rosso sat tucked in the corner of a quiet street, its facade covered in ivy and deep red roses blooming beneath the early sun, and when I stepped inside, the air was filled with the scent of freshly roasted coffee, warm bread, and a soft hint of wood. The interior was elegant without being showy, the walls a pale cream, Italian pendant lights casting a gentle amber glow, each table positioned with deliberate care to ensure complete privacy, and although Damien was not there, his assistant Luca waited at the door. He guided me through the restaurant, describing each section from the bar to the VIP rooms, from the main kitchen to the wine cellar, assuring me that if I felt any area needed change I should speak freely. I began with the smallest details, noticing the table linens did not match the lighting, that some of the paintings were too dark, weighing the room down, and I suggested replacing them with watercolor prints that would soften the space. I noted the subtle lighting beneath the wine shelves, the placement of the centerpiece flowers, the alignment of chairs, so that no empty gaps appeared when viewed from the entrance, recording everything carefully before presenting it to Luca near midday. He nodded, sometimes surprised, sometimes laughing at his own oversight, and I told him the smallest things were often the ones ignored, yet the ones that brought customers back. In the afternoon I met the head chef, a middle-aged man named Marco, stern but passionate, who led me through the kitchen, showing me how dishes were plated, how the light struck the food, the balance between appearance and flavor, explaining that good food was not enough, that beauty made people want to taste it before realizing how good it was. I listened, absorbing every element, and when the sunlight faded behind the restaurant's large windows, I realized I had worked nearly 8 hours without feeling tired, perhaps because for the first time in so long I was using my abilities, creating something meaningful, remembering how vital that feeling was. As I prepared to leave, Luca gestured for me to look toward the second floor, where Damien stood behind the large glass panel, with his hands in his pockets, watching every step I had taken throughout the day, saying nothing, never intruding, only observing, and I knew he had seen everything. I did not know why that mattered to me, but something in his gaze made me feel I was more than someone trying out a role. When I stepped out of Bella Rosso beneath the sky turning gray-blue, my heart felt strangely light, and although Damien did not appear, when I opened my bag to retrieve my phone I saw a message from his number. Just one simple line saying, "Better than I expected, thank you," and I stared at the words for a long moment before smiling softly, realizing I had stepped into another chapter of my life, a place where I was no longer defined by the past, but was beginning to be recognized for the person I was becoming. The news of Eric being released from the hospital reached me faster than I expected, arriving in a message from Julia at 9 in the morning, only 3 short words that sent a cold shiver down my spine as she wrote that he was out, and I did not need to ask or confirm with anyone because a part of me had already known this would happen, that sooner or later he would return and find a way to get close to me again, since the law never held men like Eric for long, especially when there was no clear evidence and no willing witnesses aside from me and Damien. And Damien was not the kind of man who stepped into a courtroom, while I was simply a woman who had almost been drugged and saved by the sheer coincidence of another man being present at the right moment. I had no proof, no camera recording, no confession on tape, only memories and the chill that crawled up my spine every time I remembered the look in Eric's eyes that night. For several days after receiving the message, I tried to continue my work at Bella Rosso as if nothing had changed, filling my hours, adjusting the lighting in the VIP rooms, designing the new autumn menu, and working with Marco on how to present dishes for the upcoming holiday events. Yet, even in the midst of the busy kitchen and the constant flow of tasks, I felt watched. It was not the staff, and not the regular customers, but something colder, an unfamiliar gaze that clung to me like a shadow. One evening, as I left the restaurant, I saw a silver car idling a few meters from the entrance with its engine running and no one stepping out. And when I slowed and tried to see through the dark glass, the vehicle suddenly backed up and turned swiftly down another street, and in that instant, I knew I did not have much time left to prepare myself. I told Damien everything the following night as he was checking the wine storage, and he did not look surprised, only thoughtful as he nodded and said he had not expected Eric to stop easily, and after a long silence, he told me he would assign someone to watch me, but that it was only part of the solution, that I needed to know how to protect myself as well. When I asked if he meant learning to fight, he said I did not need to become an assassin, but at least needed the skill to make a man twice my size hesitate long enough for me to run, and I let out a faint laugh, not because it was funny, but because his practicality felt grounding. 2 days later, I started my first lesson with a woman named Maria, an old friend of Damien's who had once trained media figures in personal defense, tall and fast with no softness about her, except in her patient eyes when she looked at someone carrying trauma. The first lesson was how to break free from someone grabbing me from behind, how to drive my heel into an attacker's knee, how to use my voice to draw attention, and I had expected to be clumsy or frightened, but each time I managed to push Maria away, I felt a little more air enter my lungs, as if pressure inside me was releasing in small, steady pieces. Every day after work, I went to the basement studio of an old building where dim lights flickered over the space, and the echo of bodies striking pads filled the narrow room, and Maria never asked why I was there. She simply taught, letting me fight my way through my limits. Damien never appeared at the classes and never spoke about them, but I knew he was watching the progress closely, and one night when I finished training and turned on my phone, I saw a message from him saying only that I had shifted my weight correctly today. Good job. And I had no idea where he had been standing or how long he had been watching. But I smiled with sweat still sliding down my neck, because for the first time in months I did not feel weak, and I knew that whatever gaze Eric returned with, I would no longer be the Claire he used to know, because I was slowly becoming someone I could rely on. Before anyone said anything, I sensed tension thickening the air at Bella Rosso. As employees grew more cautious, conversations between shifts became shorter, and glances held a flicker of unease, while Marco, usually loud and fiery, lowered his voice whenever someone entered the kitchen, and Luca avoided me more often, passing me with an expression I could not read. I noticed more men in black suits appearing in the VIP rooms, ordering nothing, speaking to no one, sitting still and silent like shadows planted in the elegant space. And I told Damien what I had sensed one night as we sat in his office on the second floor, with the city lights glittering behind the glass like thousands of broken shards. He poured me water before sitting across from me and asked if I had heard of the Bratva, and when I shook my head he explained it was a Russian Mafia branch firmly rooted along the east coast. Not loud like in films, but deep, and when they appeared somewhere, they did not need to speak threats. They only needed to be seen. I clasped my hands to steady my voice as I asked whether this was connected to Eric, and he nodded slightly, saying Eric had not acted alone and had protection, and that after the incident in the bar, some people felt humiliated and wanted to remind him he had stepped into their territory. I went quiet for a long moment before asking if I was part of that warning, and he did not answer immediately, only looked at me long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat pressing in my chest. And finally he said that if they believed I was his weak point, then yes. A coldness swept over me, and I stood to steady myself at the window, trying to breathe evenly, asking why he had not told me sooner. And Damien stepped forward but kept enough distance not to crowd me, saying he needed to be sure, and that he feared if I knew too early, I would run. I let out a small laugh with no real amusement, saying perhaps I still should, and he answered no with a voice as firm as steel, telling me I had learned to defend myself, that I had risen from a fall most people could not, and that they might threaten but would not act if they saw I was not afraid. I turned back to him and for the first time saw in Damien's eyes not only calculation but a buried anger held in tight restraint, and I understood that he was standing on a dangerous edge where a single misstep could bring everything down. That night when I returned to the apartment, I found a white envelope slid neatly beneath the door with no name and no mark, and inside was a photograph of me leaving the training studio with Maria, my shirt soaked through with sweat and my face exhausted, and in the lower corner someone had written in cold, precise black ink that I should be careful with what I was learning because one person needed only 10 seconds to make me forget everything. I sank to the floor with the picture trembling in my hand as old fear surged up like a tide, threatening to smother everything I had rebuilt. But then I gripped the photograph hard, drew a deep breath, and stood up, because I would not run, not ever again. I brought the photograph straight to Bella Rosso. The next morning, my mind in turmoil, though I forced my face to remain calm, and Damien was already waiting in the second-floor office, his eyes darkening the moment I set the envelope on the table between us. He did not ask where I had found it or act surprised. He simply looked at the photo for a few seconds, folded it, and slipped it into the pocket of his vest, and without any promise spoken aloud, I knew he would take care of it. But when he stood as if ready to walk out and deal with everything immediately, I reached for his hand to stop him, touching him for the first time without hesitation, and his hand was warm and steady, not tense, and when he turned back to me, his usual sharp gaze had softened, as if the layer of ice between us had finally begun to crack. I did not know why I held on for so long, only that in that moment I was not thinking about the Bratva, or Eric, or the shadows circling my life. I was thinking about Damien, the man who had protected me without ever announcing it, who stepped back when I needed space, and stepped close when I needed something solid to lean on. He sat down again, quiet for a long moment before speaking, saying he had once believed keeping distance was the best way to avoid hurting anyone, but perhaps he had been wrong. And I stayed silent, letting him continue. He said he had lost Elena because he thought he could control everything, but the truth was that some things would slip away if he never dared to step into them, and I bit down on my lip. my throat tightening as I told him he had not lost me, not as long as I was still here. He raised his hand slowly, touching my chin and lifting my face toward his, with no force, no urgency, only the unspoken question in his eyes to make sure I was not afraid, and I was not. I felt an unexpected peace, and when he leaned in and pressed his lips to mine, I closed my eyes and let that kiss be the quiet confirmation that the walls I had built were beginning to fall. The kiss did not last long, but it was enough to tell me that everything had changed. And when we parted, I rested my forehead against his shoulder while his chest rose and fell beneath my cheek, whispering words I was not sure were for him or for myself about never believing I could trust someone again. And he answered softly that he felt the same, that I made him want to try. I stayed in his arms a moment longer, before lifting my head to ask whether he believed that everything we were facing, Eric, the Bratva, our pasts, could ever truly disappear, and Damien shook his head, saying no, but he believed we could get through it, not by denying it but by facing it together. And for the first time in a long while I did not feel alone when I thought of that word together, because it did not feel like dependence but like partnership, a quiet form of trust that needed no explanation. We could not promise each other the future, neither of us could guarantee anything, but when he squeezed my hand before leaving the office, I understood that no matter how thick the darkness outside might become, as long as there was even a single thread of light, we would find our way. And in that first kiss, there had been more than attraction. There had been the beginning of something deeper, a new start chosen not out of fear but out of willingness to stay. The meeting took place on a gloomy evening with heavy clouds hanging low over the sky as if warning us of what was coming, in a third-floor office of an old building behind Bella Rosso, a place no one entered without an invitation, where Damien gathered the closest people he trusted. I sat between Luca and Maria, the only two besides Damien whom I trusted in this circle that no longer felt safe, and on the table a map of the city lay open, marked with small red dots where unfamiliar men had appeared in recent weeks. Damien stood by the window with his hands in his pockets, his eyes on the street below, though his mind was clearly elsewhere. And when he turned back, his voice was steady as he explained that the Bratva did not attack directly, but preferred to grind people down with messages and psychological pressure, and when that was not enough, they changed tactics. Luca nodded and pulled another envelope from his case, revealing more photos of me taken from a distance at multiple angles and locations, some from inside the training studio, some outside the supermarket, and worse, one taken as I stood in front of Damien's apartment. My hands tightened as I fought to keep my expression steady, and Maria placed her hand on my shoulder without words, offering the quiet support of someone who understood, and Damien looked at me without turning away this time, telling me the Bratva were focusing on me because they believed I was his weakness, and that we would make them believe it was true. I understood immediately and asked again for clarity, and he confirmed it, saying we would use me as bait, but not recklessly. We would create a situation tempting enough for them to expose themselves, a public event with media presence and our people embedded, an evening where they would think I was unprotected and would make their move. I looked around the room and felt the weight of their attention, not pressure but waiting, knowing no one would force me if I refused, and yet knowing that if I agreed I would no longer be standing behind anyone but at the center, both target and key to the plan. I straightened and said calmly that if I did this, I needed thorough preparation, every step, every person around me, because I refused to become a burden in their fight, and Damien nodded with a faint tilt of a smile, saying I had never been a burden, only someone they underestimated, which was our advantage. The plan took shape over a meeting that lasted more than 2 hours, a charity gala at Bella Rosso attended by business and media figures, where I would be the guest of honor, presented as the designer of the restaurant's new space, a role that was true but would now be layered with dangerous meaning, because every step, every handshake, every glance would be a test. Maria would stay within sight disguised as a server. Luca would coordinate undercover security inside and outside. Damien would arrive late to create the illusion that I was truly unsupervised. And everything had to unfold naturally, because a single misstep could bring the entire plan crashing down. When the meeting ended, Damien kept me back, and we stood alone in the dim hallway with the old tiled floor and the flickering fluorescent light above us as he asked if I was certain, no longer the strategist but a man worried for someone he cared about, and I met his eyes and told him I had once been so afraid of Eric that I could not open my own windows, And now I wanted to be the one who opened that door and let them see I was not hiding anymore. He stepped closer and touched my cheek with a gentleness that contradicted the tension thrumming around us, telling me that if anything felt wrong, I had to tell him, that the plan could change but I could not be replaced. And I nodded, my heart beating faster, because in his eyes I was no longer prey. I was a partner, and I was ready to step into the heart of the storm. The lights of Bellerosso shimmered more beautifully than ever that night, warm golden strands wrapped around the window frames, casting a gentle, elegant glow across the street. And the cool autumn air made the dark sapphire silk of my dress sway faintly with every step. I caught my reflection in the large glass panel at the entrance, my hair pinned in a loose twist, my lips painted in the color of red wine, the confident smile. I had practiced for 3 straight days now, resting naturally on my face, and no one could ever imagine that this woman had once been afraid to open the windows of her own apartment. I stepped inside to the sound of soft jazz, trays of sparkling wine, glinting beneath the lights, and the murmured conversations of glamorous guests. And from across the room, Luca stood in his corner with a tiny earpiece, his eyes moving through the crowd with quiet vigilance, while Maria, dressed in a server's uniform, carried drinks between tables with the calm face of a woman blending effortlessly into her surroundings. Everyone was in position. I was the centerpiece. I had to be the centerpiece. I walked past small clusters of guests, shaking hands, offering warm greetings, sharing light stories about interior design, about Italian palettes, and the inspiration I had drawn from the classical paintings of Florence. Smiling at the right moments, tilting my head just enough, my gaze steady but never sharp, every movement an impeccably rehearsed performance. I could feel a tension gathering around me, not only from the invited guests, but from those hiding in the shadows, and I did not need to turn to know that one of them was watching me closely. A tall, thin man in a silver-gray suit I had never seen at any previous event, who neither drank nor spoke to anyone, who only watched me and occasionally touched the button on his vest, where a communication device was almost certainly hidden. I walked toward the wine display where Maria had discreetly placed a large floral arrangement as our prearranged signal, took a glass, tilted my head as if searching for someone to toast, and scanned the room for Damien. He had not arrived yet, exactly as planned. I turned so the light fell across my cheekbone at an elegant angle, like stepping out of a vintage Italian portrait, and that was when the man began to move, peeling away from the wall, walking with slow, deliberate intent, and I could hear my heartbeat knocking through the heavy air, as though the entire room had paused its breath. He stopped a few steps away without speaking, and I broke the tension first with a soft, lightly teasing voice, telling him I would guess he was not there to discuss lighting composition, and he smiled thinly with the long, heavy vowels of Eastern Europe as he said he had come because of me, that everything here was beautiful, but I was the most beautiful part of it. I smiled back, hiding the tightness beneath the act, saying I was glad I had chosen the right dress, and he stepped close enough for me to smell a trace of tobacco beneath his expensive cologne, asking if I was not afraid standing in a room full of people where no one truly knew who was friend and who was enemy, and I held his gaze as I replied that fear made a person predictable, and I had no intention of being predictable, which made him smile again, a quiet, unsettling smile, before he turned away and left behind a vague, but unmistakable threat. My knees nearly softened, yet I refused to tremble because I knew Damien was somewhere watching, and right on cue, through the main entrance, he appeared. Damien walked in as if the world bent subtly around him, the black suit perfectly cut to his frame, the tie matching the deep blue of my dress, and he did not look at anyone but me, and in that instant I knew the game had shifted into its next stage, and that I was no longer a pawn but the one preparing the first true move. The man in the silver-gray suit reacted immediately, not with retreat but with an alertness like a predator sensing a stronger rival entering the field, and he slipped into the crowd with a cold ripple of tension that ran straight down my spine. I stepped backward toward the wine bar, reassessing the positions of Maria and Luca, and everything still appeared in order, yet I did not expect that at that very moment Eric would emerge. He did not try to hide himself, wearing the same smug smile, the charcoal suit perfectly tailored, and a gaze that made my stomach twist. He stepped out from a side door linked to the back hallway of Bellerosso, a passage only staff were allowed to use, and before the question of how he had slipped through security fully formed in my mind, he was already in front of me with that low, poisonous voice curling around my ear as he remarked that I always had a way of drawing attention. I went rigid but betrayed nothing, keeping the calm Maria had taught me as my eyes searched for any sign from the security team. Yet no one came, not a single movement, and I understood then that he had orchestrated my isolation with precision. He told me I should not pretend to have changed, that I was still the same woman, only better at acting now, and I took one step back before two unfamiliar men appeared behind me, closing in on each side to form a silent trap. I recognized the Bratva tattoo just beneath the cuff of one man's sleeve, and the dull realization hit with cold clarity that this was no longer intimidation. This was execution of intent. Eric leaned close, his cologne sickening, whispering that I should go with him or allow his men to assist me, and I did not scream or struggle because Maria had taught me that when cornered, one must disarm the enemy with the illusion of surrender. I nodded slightly, eyes tracking every possible exit, and said fine, not to draw attention, and Eric grabbed my wrist, pulling me toward the side corridor. Each step burned beneath my feet, but when we slipped past the kitchen door, I twisted hard, just as Maria had drilled into me, driving my weight through a sharp kick to the nearest man's knee, hearing him collapse with a cry of pain before I turned to run for the emergency exit. But Eric was too fast. He yanked my dress, dragging me backward and throwing me hard onto the floor, my heels skittering across the tiles and slamming into the wall as his hand clamped around my throat with just enough force to warn, not enough to kill, telling me not to try again, that he was being kind, and then the door burst open. Damien crashed into the room like thunder, without a single word, his first punch landing squarely across Eric's face, sending him reeling into a steel cabinet as Luca and two other men swept in behind him to restrain the remaining Bratva, and Maria rushed to my side, gripping my arm so tightly I wondered if my blood could still flow, though I felt no pain, only the tight, shaking breath of someone who had refused to break. Damien held Eric by the collar, pulling him close enough for the threat to land like a blade, as he warned that if Eric touched me again there would be nothing left of him to recognize. And Eric, blood on his lip, only laughed softly and told Damien he thought he had won, that everything was just beginning. Damien tightened his grip before shoving him violently toward Luca, ordering them to drag him out and throw him into the street. Luca asked if Damien truly would not call the police, that we had enough evidence to put him in jail immediately, and Damien gave Eric a cold, almost bored look, as he said that assault would only get him 36 hours, and a lawyer would bring him right back out, far too gentle a consequence. He stepped in front of me, blocking Eric's view but letting his voice carry so Eric could hear, as he said he wanted more than that he wanted the rotten root behind him, and that letting him go was the only way to make him drop his guard and lead them to the money laundering trap already in place, where no one would be able to pull him out again. Eric glared but said nothing as Luca muffled his mouth and dragged him down the back corridor. When the chaos finally quieted, I remained standing in the center of the kitchen, my heart pounding wildly, but my gaze no longer filled with fear. I had been dragged toward the darkness, but this time I had not fallen. I had fought back, and for the first time, I knew I was ready for whatever would come next. After the incident in the kitchen of Bella Rosso, everything seemed to settle on the surface. Yet Damien understood better than anyone that the Bratva would never stop simply because of a brief arrest. And although Eric had been taken away and disappeared from my sight for a few days, the shadow behind him still lingered, and the real danger had not faded for even a moment. So Damien quietly prepared a counterstroke, a strike meant not just to defend, but to bring an end to it all. In the days that followed, Bella Rosso remained open as usual, though beneath its polished facade a hidden system of surveillance and discreetly disguised security teams operated at full watch. And Maria trained me more rigorously in body language, emergency signals, and the art of staying calm in the face of danger, telling me that the previous encounter had merely been the warm-up, and that if I truly wanted to end everything, I would have to face Eric again, one last time. Damien did not want me to take that risk. I knew that well, but I also knew that if I kept avoiding him, there would always be a door I was too afraid to open, and a path I was too terrified to walk, and because of that, I offered to be the one to draw him out. We staged a private meeting between me and a supposed investor from Europe, someone the Bratva had attempted to recruit for a money laundering operation through high-end restaurant ventures, and the information was leaked deliberately, just enough to reach the ears that needed to hear it. And I would be the one conducting the negotiation without Damien, without Luca, only me and a single bodyguard disguised as a driver. The location was a high-floor meeting room inside an abandoned building, partly renovated and owned by one of Damien's front companies, every element carefully calculated. That day I wore a sleek gray business suit, my hair pulled back, my gaze colder than it had ever been, and on the table lay a convincing false contract, filled with numbers and terms designed to persuade the Bratva that I was acting as the intermediary for a large-scale laundering scheme. Eric arrived exactly as predicted, not alone but flanked by 2 men in black suits, all 3 scanning every inch of the room with predatory caution, and I stood to face him without blinking. He gave me that familiar smile, though the power behind it had vanished, and I saw tension flicker across his face, as though he sensed something was wrong, yet was too deeply entangled to turn back. He greeted me, his voice stretched thin as if covering anxiety, and I told him he was late, that we had only 40 minutes to finalize the deal, and I did not like wasting time. He raised a brow and sat across from me while his men hovered like shadows, and he commented on how much I had changed, promising that soon things would return to the way they were, and I met his eyes as I told him no, nothing would ever be the same, again. That was the moment Damien emerged from behind the 2-way mirror, with 3 federal agents and the security team, and the door slammed shut as orders exploded across the room, and within seconds all 3 men were forced to the ground with their hands pinned behind their backs, Eric thrashing and shouting empty threats, his gaze scattering when he saw I was still standing exactly as before, unafraid, unwavering. I walked toward him and told him that he once believed he could control me through fear, but that fear was the very thing that helped me realize I was stronger than he imagined, and he laughed bitterly with blood on his lip, asking if I thought they would protect me forever, and I shook my head, telling him I did not need protection forever, only long enough to make him disappear. When they let him out, I stood beside Damien with my breath still uneven, but my eyes entirely different. No longer the eyes of a victim, no longer a hunted creature, for I had faced the monster in my own darkness, and this time I was the one who walked out whole. The days after the ordeal passed as if someone had quietly turned down the world's clock, and gradually I stopped looking over my shoulder every time I stepped outside, no longer spotting shadows lingering across the street or receiving late-night messages from unknown numbers. And though freedom first felt strange and almost unreal, slowly I learned to trust that it was real. Damien changed as well. He no longer appeared like a distant shadow guarding me from afar, for now he was beside me openly, no longer hiding his concern behind cool words or guarded glances, and we met often at Bella Rosso, not for business or security but simply to sit together, sometimes on the rooftop where the wind moved through strings of warm yellow lights, sometimes at a tiny cafe tucked in an old alley, where wind chimes rang softly each time the door opened. Damien spoke less than before, but every word he chose was steady, full of quiet meaning, and he told me stories of the early days building Bella Rosso, the near failures, the losses, the choices that almost cost him everything, and he no longer hid anything from me. Once, sitting together on a park bench at day's end, when the sunset softened into the texture of velvet, I asked if he had ever thought of walking away from all of it to live an ordinary life, and he remained silent for a long while before admitting he once believed such a life was not meant for him, but now he was no longer sure. I looked at him and for the first time saw a longing in his eyes that was not tied to power or vengeance but to peace. I began returning to my design work as well, with new clients seeking me out through Bella Rosso's recommendations, asking for spaces that felt safe and refined, like the place they had once visited. And I never told them that the reason I chose soft curves for the light fixtures or placed chairs with their backs to the wall rather than toward the center was because healing had quietly woven its way into my hands. Julia came back into my life with the same warmth as before, hugging me tightly in front of her flower shop and telling me she was relieved that I had finally become myself again, and I did not correct her, for I knew I was no longer the Claire I had once been, but rather the version I could finally be proud of. Maria left the city for a training project in another state, but before leaving she hugged me and said that if I ever needed her, one call would bring her back. And Luca continued sending me occasional news reports about the Bratva being dismantled everywhere as his indirect way of assuring me that the nightmare was truly over. One evening, as Damien and I sat in his kitchen, where the warm light from the hanging lamp glowed against glasses of red wine, I told him I still was not used to the silence, and he looked at me, placed his hand over mine, and said that silence was not something I had to get. I used to. It was the reward. I smiled, leaning into his shoulder, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, like a quiet soundtrack for these new gentle days. And in that moment I understood that although our journey had begun in darkness filled with danger and pain, its destination was a place with the softest light, a place safe enough for us to set down our guard and peaceful enough to begin again. And neither of us was perfect, but now we were two people, healing side by side, and that was more than enough. The news of Julia's engagement arrived on a gentle Saturday morning while I was making coffee in a sunlit kitchen, and when her video call appeared on my screen, her face radiant and her hand lifted proudly to show the ring glittering beneath the light, I let out a small scream of joy, nearly spilling my cup as I shot up from my chair with a racing heart, as if I were the one who had just been proposed to. And Julia laughed softly through the screen, her eyes bright as though nothing heavy had ever rested on her shoulders. The man she was going to marry was Noah, a quiet and sincere architect who had been by her side for 2 years without ever needing to be loud about it. And I remembered the first time I met him at her flower shop, the way he gently repositioned the orchids a customer had knocked over, then slipped Julia a cup of warm tea after she dealt with someone difficult. A man who impressed not with words but with the small, steady kindnesses that last longer than any performance. They would hold their engagement party in the back garden of her shop, where the vines bloomed in deep violet in April, and the scent of lavender drifted through the air like a blessing offered by the earth itself, and I promised to help her plan it, mapping out the seating, sketching the layout, choosing each detail so the atmosphere remained simple yet heartfelt, and the process felt like its own kind of healing as I watched Julia smile more often, standing among crates of white roses and whispering thoughtfully about candlelight and sunset hues, while I saw myself too, not the Claire who once shrank inside an old coat and avoided every pair of eyes, but the Claire who held a color palette and a tape measure, confident about where every detail needed to go in order to build a setting worthy of someone's joy. Damien brought me to the party on an evening dusted with light rain, sharing a large umbrella while the cool air wrapped around us and his hand never left mine, and Julia embraced me the moment I stepped inside, her arms smelling of fresh grass and candle wax, the small squeeze saying everything she didn't need to put into words, gratitude that I was here, that we had both made it through our storms, and still had enough light left to smile. The engagement was simple yet deeply moving, with Noah making his promise in a steady, warm voice, and Julia's eyes filling with tears as he slipped the ring onto her finger, and some guests cried. Others clapped endlessly, while I stood among them feeling warmth reach into the deepest part of my chest, not only because Julia was happy, but because I could be happy for someone else freely, without fear or hesitation. When the guests had gone, Damien and I lingered in the rain-damp stone courtyard beneath the soft glow of string lights reflecting in scattered puddles like fallen stars, and he drew me close with an arm around my back, holding me in a silence that felt like shelter as I rested my cheek against his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat while thinking of Julia and the life she was building, and then of myself, realizing I had returned at last, not as the woman who once lost her way to fear and pain, but as someone who could stand steady, who could love and be loved. And in that tender quiet, I felt a peace I once believed I would never know, as if a new chapter had opened, and I was ready to live every line of it. I did not know where Damien planned to take me afterward until the car stopped before a familiar sign, slightly worn but still holding its signature charm, the Velvet Oak. And though many months had passed since that rainy night when I had stepped inside trembling and desperate to feel like myself again, a flicker of that memory still stirred as we arrived, like the last curl of smoke from a candle long extinguished. Damien stepped out first, opened my door, his expression calm yet his eyes attentive as if measuring every shift in my breathing, and I looked at the sign once more before inhaling and walking in beside him. The interior remained unchanged, the amber lights, the dark wooden bar, the whisper of jazz flowing softly through the room. But tonight there was no rain, no drenched coat clinging to my skin, no Eric watching me from a shadowed corner, only me and Damien, two people who had survived everything and returned to the place where it all began. We chose the same table from that night, the one where I sat alone, where the tampered cocktail had been placed before me, where Damien first saw me, and as I ran my fingers over the surface of the table, a strange mixture of ache and relief rose inside me. Damien sat across from me and ordered the same cocktail I once drank, saying nothing, giving me room to face my own memory. I smiled faintly when the bartender set the glass down, the scent of citrus and mint rising from it, and I placed my hand on the cold rim instead of drinking, letting the chill settle into my skin before I whispered that the first time I had walked in, I had thought I was doing something reckless. Damien asked what I thought now, and I told him I believed I needed that recklessness, because without it I might never have met him. He smiled, one of those rare, unguarded smiles that carried relief, and said he had once despised this place because it belonged to a past he wanted to bury, but perhaps not every past deserved to be buried. We sat there, in the soft quiet of the old bar, two people once swallowed by darkness now lighting something new between us, and I told him that returning here did not feel like stepping into trauma, but stepping into proof that I had survived. He admitted he had not known why he'd noticed me that night, only that something in me had caught him, something he could not look away from, and whether it was the drink or the gentle glow of the hanging lights, the air between us softened until nothing remained but honesty. Damien then reached into his pocket and placed a small key on the table, telling me it was to our new apartment, near the ocean, with a wide balcony and enough sunlight for a reading chair and a few pots of flowers. And when I stared at him in surprise, he shook his head and said it was not for me, but for us. I looked at the key, and then at him as a swell of unnamed emotion rose inside me, and instead of answering immediately, I lifted the glass to take a slow sip, discovering the drink tasted softer than I remembered, or perhaps it was simply that the bitterness no longer clung to my throat. Setting the glass down, I told him I had not fully forgiven this place yet, but I believed it deserved a new memory, and he reached for my hand across the table, his eyes warm with an unspoken promise. And there, under the gentle jazz and old lights, I realized that some places are not only the beginning of our pain, but can also be the place where we choose to begin our joy again. If we are brave enough to return and rewrite the story from the same spot where it once broke. That morning the sky was so clear it felt almost unreal, and the pale gold of early sunlight filtered through the windows of the new apartment Damien had brought me to, the place we had moved into only a few weeks earlier. Everything still felt new, from the empty bookshelf waiting to be filled with the novels I loved to the balcony furniture he had chosen because, he said, it resembled the style I often sketched in my design drafts. Damien had risen before me, a rare occurrence on days without tense meetings or security concerns, and he prepared breakfast, soft-scented eggs, toasted bread, and black coffee, with a small vase of lavender on the table, the light purple blooms carrying a breath of spring. I stepped out onto the balcony with my cup, looking toward the glittering line of the distant ocean, and Damien followed, placing his hand on my shoulder, standing silently beside me as we gazed into the endless expanse ahead. The moment was so peaceful I thought nothing could make it more extraordinary. But then he turned, stepped back inside for a moment, and when he returned, he held a deep blue velvet box in his hand. I turned, barely having time to react before he sank to one knee, his eyes lifted to mine as if there were no one else left in the world. "Claire," he said softly, "I once believed I did not deserve anything beautiful. I lived in the dark for so long that I forgot what the light felt like. Then you came in, not to save me, but to remind me the light was still there, that even someone like me could be loved. You are strong, but you are also kind and patient. You make me want to be a better man, not because I need redemption, but because I want to be worthy of your love." He opened the box, revealing a simple ring, not large or showy, just elegant and graceful, much like the quiet way I smiled whenever I saw a young plant pushing through the soil at the window. He told me he would not promise a perfect life, because he knew he was not perfect, but he promised honesty, promised to face everything with me, promised he would not run, promised he would be the person I could lean on, no matter what the world outside became. "Claire," he said, "will you help me continue this story, not as a memoir, but as a beginning, a new chapter where you are not just part of my life, but the person I call family?" I stood frozen, my heart breaking open in the most tender way, tears slipping down my bad cheeks uncontrollably. Not from surprise, but from the deep knowledge that for the first time in my life, I was being loved in the right way. Without conditions, without fear, not by someone trying to control me or fill their own emptiness, but by someone who saw who I truly was, both the fractures and the light. I knelt down with him, placing my hand over his, the one holding the ring, and whispered that I had once believed happiness was a luxury meant for other people, that survival alone was all I was allowed. But he had taught me that to live was not merely to breathe, but to feel, to dream, to trust again. And if there was anyone I wanted beside me, no matter what uncertainties waited ahead, it was him. I told him I could not promise I would always be strong, but I promised I would not let go, and I said yes, I would be his wife. Damien smiled, and in the soft morning light he slid the ring onto my finger, where it felt as though it had always belonged, and we held each other, for a long time, saying nothing more because nothing needed to be said, everything already clear in every quiet touch, in the quickened beat of our hearts, in the silent certainty that neither of us would ever have to face fear alone again. 1 year after the morning Damien knelt on the sunlit balcony, our lives had settled gently into a new rhythm, no longer defined by haunted nights or cautious footsteps through shadowed streets, and instead we lived in an apartment near the sea, where opening the door each day brought the scent of salt air and the steady pulse of waves, a soothing hymn for hearts that had once been shaken. I still worked in design, but no longer as a way to outrun pain. Now I created living spaces for people rebuilding their lives, people emerging from hardship and searching for themselves again, while Damien slowly stepped back from the underworld, passing on his influence and investing his time into quiet, lasting things, joining programs that helped young people who had gone astray, sharing his own story to show them that anyone could change if given someone who believed in them. Our life was not perfect. We still had tiring days, disagreements, and those small, late-night worries that whispered through the dark. But the difference now was that neither of us walked alone. When I faltered, his hand found mine, and when he grew silent, I learned how to listen beyond words. From the wreckage, we had built a home, one that needed no locked doors, only open hearts. The story of Claire and Damien was not only a journey out of pain, it was a reminder that sometimes the light appears in the place that once held the deepest darkness, and you do not need to be strong immediately. You only need not give up. Happiness is not a grand destination everyone can see. It is made of the small, repeated moments of every day, a gentle look, a shared meal, an embrace in the middle of an emotional storm. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. How did it make you feel? Did something in the journey of Claire and Damien resonate with a part of your own life? Have you ever faced something you thought you could never overcome, only to find strength in someone else or in yourself? We would love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment below and share with us the truest feelings from your heart. And if this story touched you, do not forget to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and share it so that more meaningful stories can reach the community. Every day we will bring new videos filled with emotion, with journeys where you may find understanding, hope, and inspiration. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video. May all of you who are following this story be blessed with good health, peaceful days, and moments of joy. Goodbye, and see you again soon.